The child's scream cut through the festival's cheerful chaos like a blade through silk, but Marcus Rivera didn't look up from his security radio until the second scream joined it. Then a third, and suddenly the entire crowd was moving wrong. 23 years of festival security had taught him to read crowds like weather patterns, and this wasn't panic over a spilled drink or lost wallet. This was primal terror, the kind that turned civilized people into stampeding animals. The Summer Solstice Festival had drawn 30,000 people to Meridian Park, families spreading picnic blankets under oak trees while children chased bubbles and couples swayed to the acoustic stage. Marcus had been watching the beer tent, making mental notes about which groups to keep an eye on as the day wore on, when the screaming started near the petting zoo. He pushed through the crowd, his radio crackling with confused chatter from other security personnel. "What's your 20, Rivera?" His supervisor's voice crackled through static. "We've got reports of some kind of disturbance." Marcus never answered. He'd reached the edge of the crowd and could see what was happening near the goat pen. A woman in a yellow sundress, he'd noticed her earlier laughing with her toddler, was crouched over something on the ground. Her movements were wrong, jerky and desperate, like a bird pecking at roadkill. Blood stained the bright fabric of her dress, spreading across the cheerful sunflowers printed on the cotton. The thing on the ground had been a man in a plaid shirt. Marcus could tell because the shirt was still mostly intact, though the chest beneath it was torn open like a Christmas present unwrapped by eager, careless hands. The woman looked up at Marcus's approach, and he saw that her eyes were milky white, completely clouded over as if she'd developed instant cataracts. Her mouth and chin were slick with blood and something else, something that looked like it had been inside the man's chest cavity. She stood up slowly, pieces of the man still hanging from her teeth. Marcus had seen bar fights, drug overdoses, heart attacks, domestic violence calls, and every other kind of human catastrophe that tended to happen when people gathered in large groups. But he'd never seen anything like this woman who moved like she was underwater, who stared at him with those dead, white eyes, who opened her mouth and let out a sound that wasn't quite human, part moan, part growl, part something else entirely. His hand went to his radio, but he couldn't make his thumb work the button. Around him, he could hear more screaming, and now he could see other figures moving through the crowd with that same underwater gait. A teenager in a band t-shirt was chasing a group of children, his arms reaching out with mechanical persistence. An elderly man in a cardigan was bent over a woman who'd been selling handmade jewelry, and the woman wasn't moving anymore. The festival continued in pockets. The acoustic stage still played, someone was still announcing the three-legged race over the PA system, the carousel kept turning with its cheerful calliope music. But Marcus could see the chaos spreading outward like ripples in a pond, each new scream marking another stone thrown into the water. The woman in the yellow sundress took a step toward him, then another. Her movements were getting faster, more coordinated. Behind her, the man in the plaid shirt was sitting up, and Marcus could see straight through the hole in his chest to the grass beneath. The man's eyes were changing, the brown irises fading to that same milky white. Marcus finally found his voice, but instead of speaking into his radio, he heard himself shouting a warning to the family 20 feet away, a father lifting his daughter onto his shoulders, both of them laughing at something the mother had said. They turned toward his voice just as the teenager in the band t-shirt crashed into them, and Marcus watched the father's expression change from confusion to terror to something else entirely as teeth found his throat. The sun was still shining. Children were still laughing somewhere in the distance. The smell of kettle corn and funnel cake still hung in the air. But Marcus Rivera, 23 years of security experience and 2 tours in Afghanistan behind him, knew with absolute certainty that the world had just ended. Part 2, Breaking News. Channel 7 News reporter Sarah Chen had been covering the Summer Solstice Festival for a fluff piece about community spirit when her cameraman Jake grabbed her arm and spun her around to face the chaos erupting behind them. She'd been interviewing a local artist about his hand-carved wooden sculptures, the kind of wholesome content that filled the slow news cycle of a Sunday afternoon, when the screaming started. "Keep rolling," she told Jake, her journalism instincts kicking in even as her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. Through the camera's viewfinder, she watched a woman in a blood-stained yellow dress pursuing a family across the grass with mechanical determination. The woman's movements were wrong, too stiff, too purposeful, like a wind-up toy that had been overwound. Sarah had covered house fires, car accidents, the occasional armed robbery, but nothing had prepared her for this. She'd never seen a person move the way these people were moving, never heard sounds like the ones coming from their throats. The woman in the yellow dress caught up to a teenage boy and tackled him to the ground, and Sarah watched in horror as the boy's screams cut off abruptly. "Sarah, we need to go," Jake said, his voice tight with panic. "This isn't safe." But Sarah was already moving toward the chaos, not away from it. This was the story of her career. She could feel it in her bones, the way she'd felt it during the factory fire last year or the city council corruption scandal. This was the kind of story that changed everything. She spoke into her microphone, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. This is Sarah Chin reporting live from Meridian Park, where what appears to be some kind of mass disturbance has broken out during the summer solstice festival. I'm seeing what looks like unprovoked attacks on festival goers. A security guard ran past them, his radio crackling with panicked chatter. Sarah caught fragments. Need paramedics at the petting zoo. Multiple casualties. They're not responding to commands. She followed the security guard toward the center of the disturbance, Jake reluctantly keeping pace beside her. The crowd was scattering in all directions now, parents scooping up children, elderly couples helping each other navigate the chaos. But some people weren't running. Some people were standing perfectly still, staring at the violence with those same milky white eyes. Sarah stopped dead when she realized what she was seeing. The woman in the yellow dress wasn't alone. There were dozens of them now, maybe hundreds, all moving with that same mechanical gait, all with those same clouded eyes. And they were all heading in the same direction, toward the fleeing crowd. "Jake, are you getting this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, I'm getting it," he replied, but his hands were shaking on the camera. "Sarah, I think we should call the police." "Look around," she said, gesturing toward the chaos. "I think someone already has." In the distance she could hear sirens, but they seemed impossibly far away. The festival grounds were huge, and emergency vehicles would have to navigate through the fleeing crowd to reach them. How long would that take? How many people would be hurt before help arrived? Sarah watched a group of these strange attackers corner a family near the craft booths. The father was trying to shield his wife and children, but there were too many of them, and they kept coming no matter how hard he fought. One of them, a teenage girl who couldn't have been more than 16, grabbed his arm and bit down hard enough that Sarah could hear the crunch of breaking bone over the screaming. "My God," she breathed into the microphone. "I'm watching what appears to be some kind of coordinated attack on festival goers. The attackers seem to be biting people and I'm seeing significant injuries." She stopped mid-sentence because the father who'd been defending his family was changing. His struggles grew weaker, then stopped altogether. His eyes rolled back, showing only white, and when he stood up, his movements had that same mechanical quality as the others. "Sarah, we need to leave right now," Jake said, tugging at her sleeve. "This isn't a riot or a terrorist attack. This is something else entirely." But Sarah couldn't move. She was transfixed by what she was seeing, her reporter's brain trying to categorize and explain the impossible. The father turned toward his own family, and Sarah watched in horror as his wife's expression changed from relief to confusion to terror. The children were crying, reaching for their father, not understanding why he wasn't protecting them anymore. That's when Sarah noticed the bite marks on the people who were attacking others. Deep, ragged wounds that should have been disabling, should have sent them to the hospital, but didn't seem to be bothering them at all. A man with half his throat torn out was chasing a group of teenagers. A woman with her arm hanging at an impossible angle was methodically pursuing a couple trying to reach their car. "Jake," she said slowly, "I need you to get a close-up of their injuries. I need people to see what we're seeing." "Are you insane?" "I need people to understand that this isn't normal. This isn't a riot or a mass psychosis or a terrorist attack. This is something else entirely, and if we don't document it, if we don't get this out to people, they won't know what they're dealing with." The sun was still shining brightly overhead, casting sharp shadows across the festival grounds. In the distance, the carousel was still playing its cheerful music, and Sarah could smell cotton candy and popcorn. But she was watching the end of the world, and she was the only person in position to tell the story. Part 3: Safe at Home. The Jenkins family had left the festival early because 8-year-old Emma was getting cranky, and David Jenkins would later wonder if those 15 minutes of his daughter's fussiness had saved their lives. They'd been driving home when the emergency broadcast interrupted the radio, but the words made no sense. Reports of violence at the festival, instructions to avoid the area, something about seeking immediate medical attention for bite wounds. "Daddy, what's happening?" Emma asked from the back seat, her voice small and worried. "I don't know, sweetheart," David said, but he was already turning onto their street, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. His wife Linda was staring at her phone, scrolling through social media posts that were becoming increasingly frantic. "David, look at this," Linda said, holding up her phone. "Someone posted a video from the festival. It looks like people are attacking each other." David glanced at the screen and immediately wished he hadn't. The video was shaky, clearly shot by someone who was running, but he could see enough to know that whatever was happening at the festival was far worse than a simple disturbance. He could see people covered in blood, moving in ways that didn't look right, pursuing others with terrifying persistence. "Turn it off," he said quietly. "Emma doesn't need to see that." They reached their house, a modest two-story colonial on a quiet residential street, and David pulled into the driveway with relief. Home meant safety, meant thick walls and locked doors and the familiar comfort of their own space. He'd upgraded their security system last year after a rash of break-ins in the neighborhood, and suddenly he was grateful for the motion sensors and reinforced locks. "Let's get inside," he said, trying to keep his voice casual. "We can figure out what's happening once we're home." But as they walked toward the front door, David noticed something that made his blood run cold. Their neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, was standing in her garden, perfectly still, staring at nothing. She was wearing the same blue dress she'd worn to the festival, but it was torn and stained with something dark. Her silver hair was disheveled, and her arms hung at her sides like broken wings. "Mrs. Patterson?" Linda called out, concern evident in her voice. "Are you okay?" The elderly woman turned toward them slowly, and David saw that her eyes were completely white, as if she'd developed instant cataracts. When she opened her mouth, the sound that came out wasn't human. It was a low, guttural moan that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. "Get inside," David said, his voice sharp with panic. "Now." Linda scooped up Emma, who was starting to cry, and they rushed toward the front door. David fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking, while Mrs. Patterson began walking toward them with that same mechanical gait he'd seen in the video. She was moving slowly but with horrible purpose, and David realized with growing horror that she wasn't alone. Across the street, he could see other neighbors emerging from their houses, all with those same milky white eyes, all moving with that same underwater slowness. The Hendersons from 2 houses down, the college student who rented the apartment above the garage, the family with the twin boys who were always riding their bikes on the sidewalk, they were all there, all changed, all moving toward the Jenkins family with patient, terrifying determination. David got the door open and shoved his family inside, slamming it shut behind them and engaging every lock. The house had never felt more fragile, more inadequate. Through the front window, he could see their neighbors gathering on the lawn, staring at the house with those dead, white eyes. "David, what's happening to them?" Linda asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," he said, but he was already moving through the house, checking windows, making sure everything was secure. "But we need to stay inside. We need to stay quiet." Emma was crying harder now, and Linda was trying to comfort her, but David could hear the fear in his wife's voice. He grabbed his phone and tried to call 911, but the lines were busy. He tried the non-emergency number, then the fire department, then the hospital. Every number he called was either busy or went straight to voicemail. Outside, more neighbors were arriving, all with those same white eyes, all moving with that same horrible purpose. David counted at least a dozen people on his front lawn, and more were visible down the street. They weren't trying to break in, yet, but they were just standing there waiting, watching the house with that mechanical patience. "Maybe they'll go away," Linda said, but even she didn't sound convinced. David was thinking about their supplies, about how long they could last locked inside their own home. They had maybe 3 days' worth of food, less if they were careful. The water would last longer, but what about after that? What about when Emma got hungry, when she started crying louder, when these things outside decided they were tired of waiting? He looked out the window again and saw Mrs. Patterson standing directly beneath the living room window, staring up at the house. Blood was trickling from her mouth, and David realized with sick certainty that she'd been at the festival when whatever happened there happened. She'd come home changed, and now she was changing others. The sun was still shining, casting long shadows across their normally peaceful street. In the distance, David could hear sirens, but they seemed to be getting farther away, not closer. Emergency services were being overwhelmed, and the Jenkins family was on their own. "We need to call someone," Linda said. "We need to get help." But David was looking at his phone, scrolling through the emergency alerts that were pouring in. Reports of violence in 12 different neighborhoods. Instructions to shelter in place. Warnings about bite wounds and infection. The word quarantine appeared in several messages, and David realized with growing horror that this wasn't just happening in their neighborhood. This was happening everywhere. Part 4. The hospital. Dr. Maria Santos had been working a double shift at Mercy General Hospital when the ambulances started arriving, and she knew within minutes that this wasn't a normal mass casualty event. She'd treated victims of car accidents, building collapses, and even a terrorist attack during her 15-year career, but she'd never seen injuries like these, and she'd certainly never seen victims who kept trying to bite the medical staff. The first ambulance brought in a family of 4 from the festival, all with deep bite wounds that looked almost surgical in their precision. The father was unconscious, his throat torn open in a way that should have been fatal, but his vital signs were stable. Too stable actually, his heart rate was slow and steady, his blood pressure normal, as if his body had adapted to the massive trauma. "Get him to Trauma Bay 3, Maria called to the paramedics, but as they transferred the man to the gurney, his eyes snapped open, revealing milky white irises that seemed to track her movement. "Has he been given any sedation?" "We tried," the paramedic said, his voice shaky. "He didn't respond to anything. Just kept trying to bite us." Maria had seen combative patients before, but there was something different about this one. His movements were too purposeful, too coordinated for someone who'd lost that much blood. When she leaned over to examine his wounds, he lunged toward her with lightning speed, his teeth snapping inches from her face. "Restraints," she ordered, stepping back. "Full restraints now." But even as the orderlies worked to secure the patient, Maria could see that something was fundamentally wrong. The man's wounds weren't bleeding anymore, despite the fact that they were deep enough to require immediate surgical intervention. His skin was taking on a grayish pallor, and his breathing was becoming shallow and irregular. More ambulances were arriving, and Maria could hear the controlled chaos of the emergency department ramping up to handle the influx of patients. But as she moved from one victim to the next, she began to notice disturbing patterns. All the patients had bite wounds. All of them were exhibiting the same strange vital signs. And all of them were becoming increasingly aggressive as time passed. "Dr. Santos," called Nurse Jennifer Walsh, her voice tight with panic. "I need you to see this." Maria hurried to Trauma Bay 1, where a teenage boy was strapped to a gurney, his arms and legs secured with thick leather restraints. His shirt had been cut away to reveal deep bite marks across his chest and shoulders, but like the others, the wounds had stopped bleeding. More disturbing was the fact that the boy was conscious and alert, staring at the medical staff with those same milky white eyes. "When did he come in?" Maria asked. 20 minutes ago, Jennifer replied. "But look at his initial vitals versus now." Maria studied the chart, her stomach dropping as she read the numbers. The boy's heart rate had dropped from 110 to 45 beats per minute. His blood pressure had stabilized at levels that should have indicated shock, but his oxygen saturation was perfect. His body temperature was dropping steadily, but he showed no signs of hypothermia. "This is impossible," she murmured, but even as she spoke, she could see similar readings on the monitors throughout the trauma bay. Every patient who'd been brought in from the festival was exhibiting the same vital signs, the same strange stability despite massive trauma. The boy on the gurney suddenly began thrashing against his restraints with inhuman strength. The leather straps groaned under the pressure, and Maria could see the metal buckles starting to bend. His movements were perfectly coordinated, not the random flailing of someone in pain or confusion, but the deliberate actions of a predator testing its bonds. "Jennifer, get security down here now," Maria ordered, but her voice was drowned out by a commotion from the waiting area. Through the trauma bay windows she could see people running, and she could hear screaming that was becoming all too familiar. "Dr. Santos." The hospital's PA system crackled to life. "Dr. Santos to the emergency department stat. We have a code gray." Code gray meant a combative patient, but as Maria rushed toward the main ED, she realized this was something far beyond a single combative patient. The waiting area was in chaos, with people fleeing in all directions while others pursued them with that same mechanical determination she'd seen in the trauma bay. A woman in scrubs, Maria recognized her as one of the triage nurses, was chasing a family toward the exit, her movements stiff and unnatural. Blood covered the front of her uniform, and when she turned toward Maria, her eyes were completely white. "Jennifer, call the CDC," Maria said, grabbing her colleague's arm. "Call the state health department. Call whoever you need to call, but get someone down here who can tell us what we're dealing with." But Jennifer was staring at something behind Maria, her face pale with terror. Maria turned to see that the patients from the festival were breaking free from their restraints, one by one, their movements becoming more coordinated as they worked together to escape the trauma bays. The teenage boy was the first to break completely free, tearing through the leather restraints like they were paper. He stood up slowly, his head turning toward the sound of voices in the main ED, and Maria realized with growing horror that he was tracking the uninfected people by sound. "We need to evacuate," she said, but even as she spoke, she could see that it was too late. The hospital was filling with people fleeing the chaos outside, and many of them were already infected, already changing. The building that was supposed to be a sanctuary was becoming a trap. The power went out suddenly, plunging the hospital into emergency lighting that cast everything in a hellish red glow. In the distance, Maria could hear the groans and screams of the infected, and she knew that whatever was happening at the festival had spread far beyond the park. The sun was still shining outside, but inside Mercy General Hospital, the world was ending one bite at a time. Part 5. The Broadcast. By the time Emergency Services Coordinator Jack Morrison reached the temporary command center set up 3 blocks from the festival grounds, the situation had spiraled far beyond anything in the disaster response protocols. He'd coordinated responses to floods, tornadoes, chemical spills, and terrorist threats, but nothing had prepared him for the reports coming in from every sector of the city. "Give me a status report," he barked at the assembled team of police officers, firefighters, and EMTs who'd managed to establish a perimeter around the affected area. But even as he spoke, he could see the fear in their eyes, the way they kept glancing toward the festival grounds as if expecting something to come charging out of the tree line. "Sir, we've got reports of similar incidents at 7 different locations across the city," said Police Captain Rebecca Hayes, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "The hospital, 3 residential neighborhoods, the mall, and 2 apartment complexes. All started with people who were at the festival." Jack studied the map spread across the table, red pins marking each reported incident. The pattern was clear. The infection was spreading outward from the festival like ripples in a pond, carried by people who'd fled the initial outbreak. But unlike any epidemic he'd studied, this one was spreading with terrifying speed. "What about the CDC?" he asked. "Are they sending a team?" "They're trying," said Dr. Elena Vasquez, the city's chief medical officer. "But they're getting similar reports from 6 other states. Whatever this is, it's not contained to our area." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. He'd been coordinating with state and federal agencies for the past 2 hours, but the reports were becoming increasingly grim. Cities across the country were reporting similar outbreaks, all starting at large public gatherings, all spreading with the same horrifying speed. "Sir," called out Communications Officer Danny Park, "we're getting reports that the broadcast stations are being overrun. Channel 7 went dark 20 minutes ago, and we're losing contact with radio stations across the region." Jack grabbed the radio from Danny's desk and tried to raise the National Guard unit that was supposed to be en route from the state capital. Static filled the airwaves, punctuated by occasional fragments of panicked communications from other emergency services. The infrastructure they relied on for coordination was collapsing faster than they could respond. "We need to get a message out," he said, his mind racing through the options. "People need to know what they're dealing with. They need to know how to protect themselves." But even as he spoke, Jack realized they didn't really know what they were dealing with. The reports from the medical teams were inconsistent and contradictory. Some described victims who were unconscious and unresponsive. Others reported aggressive behavior that required multiple officers to contain. The only consistent elements were the bite wounds and the gradual change in the victim's appearance and behavior. "Sir, we're getting reports that the infected are gathering in large groups," said Captain Hayes. "They seem to be coordinating their movements, heading toward areas with high population density." Jack looked at the map again, this time focusing on the movement patterns. The infected weren't spreading randomly, they were moving with purpose toward schools, shopping centers, apartment complexes. Places where they could find more people to infect. "How many people were at the festival?" he asked. 30,000, Dr. Vasquez replied. "But only about half of them were there when the outbreak started. The rest had already left." Jack did the math in his head and the numbers were staggering. 15,000 people potentially infected, spreading out across a metropolitan area of 2 million. If the infection rate was as high as the report suggested, they were looking at a complete collapse of social order within days, maybe hours. "Sir," Danny called out, "I'm getting reports that the interstate is completely blocked. People are trying to flee the city, but the infected are following the traffic patterns. They're attacking vehicles stuck in traffic." Jack grabbed his binoculars and climbed to the roof of the command center. From this vantage point, he could see smoke rising from multiple locations across the city. In the distance, he could see the interstate packed with vehicles that weren't moving, and even from this distance he could see people running between the cars, some pursuing others with that mechanical determination he'd seen in the security footage from the festival. The sun was still shining brightly, casting everything in sharp relief that made the chaos seem even more surreal. This was supposed to be a beautiful summer day, the kind of day when families went to festivals and children played in parks. Instead, it was the day civilization ended. "Sir, we've got incoming," Captain Hayes called from below. Large group of infected approaching from the east. Jack looked through his binoculars and saw them, dozens of people walking down the street with that same stiff, purposeful gait. They were moving in a loose formation, but there was something organized about their approach that made Jack's blood run cold. These weren't random victims of some kind of chemical contamination or mass psychosis. These were predators and they were hunting. Fall back to the secondary position, he ordered, but even as he spoke, he could see similar groups approaching from other directions. The command center was surrounded, and the infected were closing in with patient, terrifying determination. Jack grabbed the emergency radio and began broadcasting on all frequencies, hoping someone, somewhere was still listening. This is Emergency Services Coordinator Jack Morrison. The situation is beyond containment. Repeat, the situation is beyond containment. If you're hearing this, find shelter immediately. Do not trust anyone who's been bitten. Do not attempt to help the infected. They are no longer human. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. The infrastructure of civilization was crumbling around him, and all he could do was hope that someone would hear his warning and survive long enough to find a way to fight back. Part 6. The Alliance. 3 days after the festival, the survivors had learned to move quietly through the ruins of their city. Maya Rodriguez had gathered 12 people in the basement of an abandoned grocery store, creating a makeshift shelter from the chaos that had consumed the world above. The group was a random collection of strangers who'd found each other in the aftermath. A high school teacher, a mechanic, a mother with her infant son, an elderly man who'd survived 2 wars, and others who'd lost everything except their determination to stay alive. "We can't stay here much longer," Maya said, studying the map spread across the concrete floor. "The infected are getting more organized. They're learning to track us." She'd been a social worker before the outbreak, trained to help people navigate crises, but nothing had prepared her for this. The infected, they'd stopped calling them people after the first day, were evolving. Their movements were becoming more coordinated, their hunting patterns more sophisticated. They were learning to work together in ways that suggested intelligence, or at least some kind of collective instinct. "Where would we go?" asked Tom Chin, the high school teacher who'd become Maya's unofficial second-in-command. "The roads are blocked, the airports are overrun, and every shelter we've tried has been compromised." Maya looked around at the faces of her group, seeing the exhaustion and fear that had become their constant companions. Sarah Martinez, the young mother, was trying to keep her baby quiet while simultaneously checking the perimeter. Frank Williams, the elderly veteran, was cleaning the rifle he'd salvaged from a sporting goods store. Each person had their own story of loss, their own moment when the world had ended for them personally. "I've been monitoring the radio transmissions," said Danny Park, the communications officer who joined them after the command center fell. "There are reports of safe zones being established in rural areas, places where the population density is low enough that the infected haven't been able to gain a foothold." "How far?" Maya asked. 50 miles north. There's a town called Cedar Ridge that's supposedly been cleared and fortified. They're calling for survivors to make their way there." Maya studied the map, tracing potential routes with her finger. 50 miles through infected territory, with a group that included an infant and an elderly man. The odds were terrible, but staying put was essentially a death sentence. The infected were getting bolder, more persistent. It was only a matter of time before they found a way into the basement. "We'll need supplies," she said. "Food, water, medical equipment. And we'll need to travel at night when the infected are less active." "Are they less active at night?" asked Maria Santos, the doctor who'd escaped from the hospital on the first day. "Or are we just hoping they are?" Was a good question. The infected seemed to be drawn to sound and movement, but their behavior patterns were still largely unknown. They'd observed that the infected were slower in cold weather, more aggressive when they were in groups, and seemed to have some kind of communication system that allowed them to coordinate their attacks. But there was so much they didn't understand. "We'll travel in small groups," Maya decided. 2 or 3 people at a time, with the rest providing cover. If one group gets caught, the others can escape. "And if we all get caught?" asked Tom. Maya didn't answer because they all knew the answer. They'd all seen what happened to people who got caught by the infected. The bite wounds were just the beginning. The real horror was what came after. The gradual loss of humanity, the transformation into something that was no longer recognizably human. "We move tomorrow night," she said. "Use today to gather supplies and plan our route. Remember, we're not just trying to survive, we're trying to stay human." As the group dispersed to their various tasks, Maya found herself thinking about the world they'd lost. 3 days ago, she'd been worried about budget meetings and case files. She'd been planning a vacation, thinking about dating again after her divorce, wondering if she should adopt a dog. All of those concerns seemed impossibly trivial now, remnants of a world that no longer existed. The infected had taken everything, homes, families, futures, but they'd also revealed something about humanity that Maya hadn't expected. In the face of absolute horror, people were capable of extraordinary courage. They were capable of making impossible choices and finding hope in the darkest circumstances. Sarah's baby started crying, and Maya watched the young mother comfort him with gentle words and soft touches. The baby had been born into a world of monsters, but his mother was determined to give him a childhood, to preserve some piece of innocence in the midst of nightmare. "Maya," called Frank from his position near the stairs. "We've got movement upstairs. Sounds like a small group." Maya grabbed her weapon, a crowbar she'd taken from the hardware store, and moved toward the stairs. Through the small window at ground level, she could see shadows moving past the building. The infected were still searching, still hunting, but they were also adapting to the survivors' tactics. "How many?" she whispered. "4, maybe 5, Frank replied. "They're moving differently. More careful, like they're trying to be quiet." Maya felt a chill run down her spine. If the infected were learning to be stealthy, it changed everything. The survivors had relied on the infected's tendency to move in large, noisy groups, but if they were adapting their hunting strategies, nowhere would be safe. The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows across the abandoned city. Tomorrow night, they would begin their journey to Cedar Ridge, hoping to find safety in a world that had forgotten what safety meant. But tonight, they would wait in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the infected searching for them, and wondering if they would live to see another dawn. Part 7. The Journey. The journey to Cedar Ridge began at midnight, with Maya's group split into 3 teams moving through the skeletal remains of suburban neighborhoods. The infected had been busy in the days since the outbreak, and the evidence of their work was everywhere. Overturned cars, broken windows, dark stains on the pavement that Maya tried not to think about too closely. She was leading the first team, consisting of herself, Tom, and Frank, while Sarah and her baby traveled with Danny and Maria in the second group. The third team, bringing up the rear, consisted of the remaining survivors who joined them over the past few days. The plan was simple: move quietly, avoid contact with the infected, and reach the highway that would take them north to Cedar Ridge. But the infected had other plans. Maya first noticed the trap when they were halfway through the residential district. The infected weren't randomly wandering through the streets as they had been in the first days. They were positioned strategically, blocking escape routes and herding the survivors toward a central location. It was a level of coordination that suggested intelligence, or at least some kind of collective consciousness that allowed them to work together. "This is wrong," Frank whispered, his weathered face creased with concern. "They're not hunting randomly. They're driving us somewhere specific." Maya studied the street ahead, noting the infected figures positioned at key intersections. They weren't attacking, weren't making noise, weren't exhibiting the aggressive behavior that had characterized their actions in the early days. Instead, they were waiting, watching, allowing the survivors to move forward but cutting off any chance of retreat. "Tom, signal the other teams," she said quietly. "Tell them to hold position." But when Tom tried to raise the other groups on their handheld radios, he got only static. The infected had learned to interfere with their communications, or perhaps they'd simply destroyed the cell towers and radio transmitters that made long-range communication possible. "We're on our own," Tom said, his voice barely audible. Maya made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "We keep moving forward. If this is a trap, we spring it on our terms." They crept through the shadows, using abandoned cars and overgrown hedges for cover, but Maya could feel the infected watching them from the darkness. There were more of them than she'd initially realized. Dozens, maybe hundreds, all moving with that same patient, purposeful gait that had become the soundtrack of their nightmares. The trap was sprung when they reached the town center, a small commercial district that had once been the heart of the suburban community. The infected emerged from every doorway, every alley, every hiding place, surrounding the survivors with mechanical precision. But they didn't attack immediately. Instead, they formed a loose circle, watching and waiting. "What do they want?" Tom asked, his voice tight with fear. Maya was wondering the same thing. In the early days, the infected had attacked immediately, driven by some kind of feeding instinct that compelled them to bite and spread the contagion. But these infected were different. They were exhibiting behavior that suggested planning, patience, perhaps even curiosity. One of the infected stepped forward, a woman who might have been a teacher or a librarian in her previous life, dressed in a cardigan that was now stained with blood and dirt. Her eyes were the familiar milky white, but there was something else there, something that might have been recognition. The woman opened her mouth and made a sound, not the usual mindless moan, but something that almost resembled speech. Other infected began making similar sounds, creating a low, harmonious chorus that seemed to carry meaning, though Maya couldn't understand what they were trying to communicate. "They're trying to talk to us," Frank said, his voice filled with wonder and horror. Maya realized he was right. The infected were attempting some form of communication, and their behavior suggested that they retained some memory of their former lives. The woman in the cardigan was looking directly at Maya, and there was something in her expression that seemed almost sad. "Can you understand us?" Maya asked, feeling foolish but desperate to make contact. The woman tilted her head, and her mouth moved in what might have been an attempt at words. The sound that emerged was distorted, barely recognizable as human speech, but Maya thought she caught fragments. "Help us. Remember?" The realization hit Maya like a physical blow. The infected weren't just mindless monsters. They were trapped, conscious beings who retained some fragment of their humanity but were unable to control their actions. They were prisoners in their own bodies, watching helplessly as they committed acts of violence against the people they'd once loved. "We can't help you," Maya said, tears streaming down her face. "We don't know how." The woman's expression changed, and Maya saw something that looked like understanding, perhaps even forgiveness. Then the moment passed, and the infected began closing in, their movements becoming more aggressive as whatever remained of their humanity lost the battle against the contagion. Maya and her team fought their way out of the trap, but at a terrible cost. Frank was bitten while covering their escape, and though he showed no immediate signs of infection, they all knew what would happen. The elderly veteran who'd survived 2 wars and the collapse of civilization would become one of the monsters they were fleeing from. They made it to the highway as the sun was rising, but Maya knew that everything had changed. The infected weren't just a threat to be avoided, they were victims of something beyond their control, and killing them meant destroying what remained of their humanity along with their bodies. The journey to Cedar Ridge continued, but Maya carried with her the knowledge that they weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting to preserve something essential about being human, something that the infected had lost but still remembered, still mourned. And in the woman's eyes, Maya had seen a reflection of what they all might become if they couldn't find a way to stop the spread of the contagion. The sun was rising over a world that had forgotten what it meant to be human, and Maya wondered if they were already too late to save it. Part 8. The Reckoning. Cedar Ridge was supposed to be a sanctuary, but when Maya's remaining survivors crested the hill overlooking the town, they found something that defied every assumption they'd made about the outbreak. The town was intact, its buildings undamaged, its streets clean, and it was populated by both the infected and the uninfected, living together in what appeared to be peaceful coexistence. "This is impossible," Tom whispered, staring through the binoculars at the scene below. "How are they not attacking each other?" Maya took the binoculars and studied the town more carefully. She could see infected individuals moving through the streets with their characteristic stiff gait, but they were interacting with uninfected people in ways that suggested cooperation rather than predation. Children were playing in a park while infected adults watched from nearby benches. A group of survivors was unloading supplies from a truck while infected individuals helped carry the boxes. "We need to get closer," she said, but even as she spoke, she noticed movement on the road behind them. Their journey from the city had attracted attention, and a group of infected was following their trail with patient determination. "We don't have a choice," said Maria, who'd been treating Frank's bite wound with antibiotics that probably wouldn't help. "Frank's getting worse and we can't outrun them much longer." Frank had been fighting the infection for 3 days, but Maya could see the changes beginning. His skin was taking on the grayish pallor she'd learned to associate with the infected, and his eyes were starting to cloud over. Most disturbing was the way his personality was shifting. The gruff but caring veteran was becoming something else, something that watched the other survivors with an intensity that made Maya's skin crawl. "I can feel it," Frank said, his voice barely recognizable. "It's like there's someone else in my head trying to take control. But I can still think, still remember who I am." Maya realized that Frank was experiencing what the woman in the cardigan had tried to communicate. The infected retained their consciousness and memories, but they were no longer in control of their actions. They were prisoners in their own bodies, forced to watch as the contagion used them to spread itself. As they approached the town, they were met by a delegation that included both infected and uninfected individuals. The leader was a man in his 50s who introduced himself as Dr. Richard Hayes, a microbiologist who'd been studying the outbreak since it began. "We've been expecting you," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "We've been monitoring radio transmissions from the city, and we know what you've been through." "How is this possible?" Maya asked, gesturing toward the mixed group. "How are you living with them?" Dr. Hayes smiled sadly. "Because we realized that them is still us. The infected retain their memories, their personalities, their capacity for love and compassion. The contagion doesn't destroy their humanity, it just makes them unable to control their actions when they're driven by hunger or fear." He led them to a research facility that had been established in the town's former high school. The walls were covered with charts and graphs documenting the progression of the infection, but also something else: evidence of communication between the infected and the uninfected. "We've developed a system," Dr. Hayes explained. "The infected can communicate through a combination of sounds and gestures. They've retained their intelligence and emotional capacity, but they need help controlling their more destructive impulses." Maya watched through a window as infected individuals worked alongside uninfected people in a garden, their movements carefully supervised but clearly purposeful. It was a scene that challenged everything she thought she knew about the outbreak. "The key," Dr. Hayes continued, "is understanding that the contagion isn't just a disease, it's a catalyst for human evolution. The infected are developing new forms of consciousness, new ways of processing information and relating to each other. They're not becoming less human, they're becoming something new." "But they kill people," Tom said. "They spread the infection." "Only when they're frightened or hungry," Dr. Hayes replied. "With proper care and understanding they can control those impulses. The infected here haven't attacked anyone in weeks." Maya felt a complex mix of hope and skepticism. If Dr. Hayes was right, if the infected could be helped to control their actions, then perhaps there was a future for humanity after all. But she'd seen too much violence, too much loss, to accept such a radical shift in perspective easily. Frank approached them slowly, his movements becoming more mechanical but his eyes still recognizably human. "I can hear them," he said, his voice distorted but still comprehensible. "The infected in town. They're welcoming me. They want to help me adjust." "Frank," Maya said, taking his hand. "Are you still you?" He smiled, and for a moment he looked like the gruff veteran who'd protected them during their journey. "I'm still me. I'm just more than I was before. I can sense things I couldn't sense before, understand things that were hidden from me." Over the following days, Maya watched as Frank integrated into the infected community while maintaining his relationships with the uninfected survivors. It was a delicate balance, requiring constant communication and mutual understanding, but it was working. The sun was setting on their first week in Cedar Ridge when Maya finally accepted the truth that Dr. Hayes had been trying to teach her. The outbreak hadn't been the end of humanity, it had been the beginning of something new. The infected weren't monsters to be feared or destroyed, but partners in the next phase of human evolution. The world had ended while the sun was still shining, but from its ashes, something unprecedented was being born. Nothing would ever be the same again, but perhaps that wasn't the tragedy Maya had thought it was. Perhaps it was the greatest opportunity humanity had ever been given, the chance to become something better, something more than they'd ever imagined possible. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, Maya listened to the sounds of the town, infected and uninfected voices blending together in conversation, children's laughter mixing with the deeper harmonies of the evolved consciousness. It was the sound of a new world being born, and despite everything they'd lost, Maya found herself looking forward to discovering what they might become.